In the lands of the rolling Caucasian mountains lay several skeletons in the closet of the Russian Federation. The invasion of Ukraine was not the first military action Moscow took against a sovereign nation in Eastern Europe. In fact, only 12 years earlier, Russian forces marched into Georgia, a separate and independent country, following similar pretenses. Georgia, with its capital in Tbilisi, is a mountainous country located in the southern Caucasus, for Armenia to the south and Russia to the north. Georgia, like many countries in the post-Soviet sphere, is culturally diverse, with Abkhazians and Ossetians in the north and Adjarians and Armenians to the south. To the west lies the Black Sea, where Russia is able to project power. Georgia is an ancient country with a long and rich history. Throughout much of its past, it has been dominated by its far larger neighbors, may it be Russia, Iran, Arabia, or Turkey, etc. In 1921, it was overtaken by a new superpower, the Soviet Union. As an SSR, Georgia sacrificed thousands of their men fighting for Moscow in Germany and Afghanistan. Georgia also gave the Soviet Union one of its most infamous dictators, Joseph Stalin. When the Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, Georgia declared independence, becoming one of three internationally and universally recognized states in the Caucasus. However, the Ossetians and the Abkhaz did not seek to join Tbilisi, waging wars and mostly securing their de facto sovereignty. None of these separate states were able to gather international recognition at that time except from Russia, despite that country's preoccupation with wars in Chechnya. In 2003, following a fraudulent election, Georgians rose up against their tin pot dictator, Shevardnadze. New elections were called the following year. Mikhail Saakashvili was elected president with 96% of the vote. Saakashvili decided to pursue pro-European and pro-NATO policies, angering Russia and the two separatist states. For example, he continued the 1st Brigade's deployment supporting U.S. forces in Iraq. One of Saakashvili's goals was to rein in South Ossetia and Abkhazia back into their jurisdiction. Following a rejected proposal of increased autonomy of South Ossetia, Russo-Georgian tensions increased. Each incident threw more fuel to the fire. The incidents got so bad that South Ossetian forces were alleged to have attempted to shoot down a Georgian helicopter carrying the Minister of Defense. In the May of 2008, Putin stepped down from the presidency and passed down the title of president to his crony Dmitry Medvedev. However, it is widely believed that Putin was still the one true power broker, working in the shadows. Two events occurred during the beginning of 2008 that would increase the tensions in the South Caucasus. First of all, Kosovo, following a decade of de jure authority, formally declared independence from Serbia. Russians, including the then President Dmitry Medvedev, pointed to Kosovo and asked why South Ossetia and Abkhazia couldn't be treated the same way. They neglect to mention that Milosevic attempted genocide against Albanian Kosovars, which did not happen in Georgia's case. Second of all, during that year's NATO conference in Bucharest, NATO members debated upon nominating Georgia and Ukraine for NATO action plans. Any Georgian entry into the organization would severely hamper Russia's position in Eastern Europe, opening a new front in the event of a war. With South Ossetia and Abkhazia breaking all relations with Georgia, it became clear that there would be no escape from war. Under the guise of construction assistance and peacekeeping, Russia sent hundreds of soldiers into two separate zones. Both literally and figuratively, the infrastructure for Russia's war was laid. Just as in the prelude to the war in Ukraine, Russia started large-scale military exercises, known as the Kafkaz 2008, on the border. In such exercises, Russians were in wargaming situations with Georgia. Should have been obvious for the West at that point. Tensions finally came to a head on August 1st, when South Ossetians exploded an ID next to a Georgian police vehicle. Georgia responded by starting sniper fire, resulting in 11 casualties. In response to that response, South Ossetian forces started shelling neighboring villages controlled by Georgians. As published by both Russian and European peacekeepers, South Ossetia's shelling violated a 1992 ceasefire that ended the First War, but it was just a sign for things to come. On August 7th, Georgia Saakashvili made his last plea, declaring a ceasefire and attempting to persuade South Ossetia by promising autonomy and announcing Georgia's intention to come to an agreement with Russia. Unfortunately, it was too little too late. Clashes continued unabated throughout South Ossetia. During the midnight of August 7th, Moscow time, Georgian forces started their invasion. The largest spearhead of Georgia's invasion was against South Ossetians in the regional capital Skinvali. Georgia's military brass sought to seize the city, destroy the rocky tunnel, the only interconnection between South Ossetia and Russia, and seize the Trans-Caucasus Highway. If they could execute this plan successfully, Tbilisi would, for the first time, have complete control of South Ossetia. Unfortunately for Saakashvili, they were unable to fully execute the plan. The Georgian army believed that it would take days for Russia to regroup and move into South Ossetia. They were completely wrong. Due to Georgian failures to block or destroy the rocky tunnel, Russians were able to flow into Skinvali and supported the already dug in and fortified South Ossetian militants. Another factor of modern war is air superiority. While the Georgians were able to shoot down a few planes, their enemies held almost complete air superiority, raining hell down below. With their previous plan now completely infeasible, Georgia withdrew from Skinvali in poor and dismayed condition. Russian air power and artillery power started to bombard towns and bases in Georgia, turning the invasion of South Ossetia into an existential challenge for Tbilisi. Signaling a new stage in the war, Saakashvili announced a 3-hour humanitarian ceasefire, allowing civilians to evacuate and flee from the crossfire. The ball had significantly rolled into Russia's court. Russian forces, backed up with more reinforcements, including from the ruthless Chechen Kadyrov Brigade, which was made famous later in Ukraine, launched incursions deeper across the Ossetian border, targeting Georgian military infrastructure and leading to the capture of Gori, a town of 40,000. Anticipating the next Russian move, Georgian forces dug in and fortified Tbilisi, bringing in the 1st Brigade from Iraq and calling for Western aid. All of this occurred in a matter of days, really emphasizing the speed at which modern military operations occur at. With most of the Georgian army tied up near South Ossetia, Abkhazia, the other separate state, in coordination with Russian forces, launched a large-scale offensive against the then Georgian-controlled Kadori Ridge. Kadori Ridge lies in a strategic position in the Abkhazian region, neighboring the separatist capital of Sukhumi, as well as other major cities. The Russian army also took the opportunity to damage Georgian naval capabilities along the Black Sea. From their ships blockading Georgian coastline, Russia launched cruise missiles to strike against enemy boats and warships, forcing them down south so as to not impede the mission in Kadori Ridge. On the ground, Russian forces moved into western Georgia, destroying bases and sinking abandoned warships docked on the Georgian port of Pati. With the fall of Kadori Ridge on the 12th of August, Medvedev announced the drawback of Russian troops from Georgia, saying that they had beaten back the aggressor. The next day, Russia and Georgia signed a ceasefire negotiated directly by Sarkozy of France. However, the war continued, with the BBC going as far to call the notion of an ongoing truce ridiculous. After all, Russian soldiers were still occupying Georgian towns. The truce did eventually come to fruition, however. On August 26, Medvedev made a televised speech announcing Russia's formal recognition of the independence of South Ossetia and Abkhazia. By the end of the month, Russian forces started to withdraw from various towns and cities that are internationally undisputedly considered Georgian. The war had effectively ended in a major Russian victory. The entirety of South Ossetia was secured, Kadori Ridge was secured, and Georgian entry into NATO would be stalled. In what would soon be called the August War, or the Five-Day War, Georgia lost 169 soldiers in the fighting, while Russia and the separate states lost a combined total of 93 soldiers. The total number of killed civilians is disputed among many sources, but the South Ossetians claim that 220 civilians were wounded, while the Georgians claim that 220 of their civilians were killed. In the aftermath of the war, thousands of ethnic Georgians would be deported and expelled from Abkhazia, uprooting communities. For the first time in history, but not the last, Russian forces captured American Humvees. While the Russian forces wiped the floor with the Georgians, the conflict still revealed major faults within their army. Coordination within the Russian Air Force and ground forces was lacking in several instances. For example, according to Putin's Wars by Mark Galeotti, almost as many Russian casualties were actually sustained in road crashes and other accidents as from Georgian artillery. Incidents of friendly fire between Russian forces were reported. Russian tanks were outfitted with old reactive armor, stuck in intense traffic in the rocky tunnel. As a foreshadowing for what's to come, aging Soviet-era Russian equipment had almost a disposition to break down in Georgia. Internationally, the Russian Georgian War caused minor Western backlash, nowhere at the future level of the war in Ukraine. No sanctions were levied because of the August War. Nord Stream 1, the pipeline between Germany and Russia, continued without a hitch. Obama, the then President of the United States, and Medvedev would continue diplomatic overtures and anti terror related assistance. Relations between the West and Russia proved so high at that time that European and American soldiers paraded and marched down Red Square during the 2010 annual World War II Victory Day parade. In Russia, the shortcomings in the August War caused the government to institute major changes within their military. Much of the fat of the Russian army was trimmed. The total number of officers were cut, many prehistoric brigades were disbanded, and an NCO corps was created, serving as a tool to professionalize soldiers. These changes would soon become apparent when nondescript Russian forces occupied and invaded parts of the Donbass and all of Crimea after the 2014 Euromaidan revolution in Ukraine. During the 2010s, Russia pioneered a form of mercenary warfare, using the brutal but semi-official Wagner Group across many global conflicts to establish a form of plausible deniability. Russia would involve itself in the Syrian civil war, launching intense airstrikes against the Islamic State and the Syrian opposition, proving instrumental in the Assad regime's continued survival and strength. During the late 2010s and early 2020s, as French and Western influence in West Africa started to wane, the Russians came in droves to replace their roles, arming and training local military regimes against Islamist militants and terrorists. Global climate during this time signaled the start of a new Cold War. In Georgia, pro Western policies continued to permeate the political sphere. Saakashvili continued to rule his country until he peacefully stepped down after an election, letting the Georgian Dream Party take over the reins. Georgian Dream started off as a pro European, populist, and big tent political party. However, as the 2020s started and marched on, hopes in Georgia for joining NATO and the EU slowed down, the party becoming more liberal and less pro West as a result, culminated in the 2023 attempt and 2024 passing of a Russian style foreign agent bill. This bill has widely been condemned in Georgian society, inspiring thousands of protesters to line the streets of several cities. Due to the country's continued liberalization, the EU has halted Georgia's succession to the Union. To this day, Russian forces continue to be deployed along the Georgian border, propping up both South Ossetia and Abkhazia. Putin's largest test started on February 24, 2022, when Russian forces used the pretext of a supposed Nazi regime, so-called 8-year war in Donbass, 8-year genocide in Donbass, to launch a multi-pronged offensive on the rest of Ukraine. Initial Western intelligence stated that Ukraine would fold in a matter of days, but nothing could be further from the truth. As a result of poor coordination, poor planning, horrible traffic jams, and the inability to acquire air superiority, Russia was unable to fully subdue and capture Ukraine. Much of the problems faced by the Russian army in Georgia were similarly faced by them in Ukraine, albeit on a far larger scale. The decade or so of almost constant Russian success in non conventional conflict had misled observers of Russia's true military capabilities. In reality, the New Look Army 2008 reforms did not fix long standing and deeply entrenched issues of corruption and hazing. The first days of war, the communication issues were so bad that Russian forces were using unencrypted radio signals, allowing random people to join in and watch. As the war went on, some of these issues were solved while others took more time to fix. In conclusion, the 2008 war in Georgia served as a testing ground for Vladimir Putin and the Russian regime. The relative international silence at the Russian invasion proved to Putin and that the West would not react if they invaded Ukraine. The almost continuous flow of NATO arms and vehicles going into Ukraine have strongly disproved this theory. The echoes of the Russian-Georgian War continued to reverberate across the halls of government in Eastern Europe without end.